Thank you. So I'm David Goodall. I'm married to Tara. So if you come into our house and you turn right, you find the Yorkshire North and East office, and you turn left, you find the Yorkshire West office. So we work across two of the districts in the region between us. And my role has two halves to it. So I'm half-time. I work in Leeds City Centre with the wonderful Emily as the missional communities enabler in the city centre. So seeking with my colleagues to build a network of communities in the life of Leeds City Centre that embody our values of sanctuary, encounter, justice and flourishing. And I can talk about that at other times, but that's not what I'm here to talk about this morning. And then in the other half of my life, I am a better title would be the district mission enabler. So for those of you who are in the Sheffield district, I sort of do Neil's job across the Yorkshire West district. And for those of you in the Yorkshire North and East district, I do a bit of David's job and a bit of Andy's job across the district here, but with a particular focus on encouraging churches and circuits to think about a Methodist way of life and how that might help us to be more intentional about our mission and our discipleship. So this morning I was asked to talk a bit about that, and I want really to look at two things. I want to give a bit of an overview of a Methodist way of life, and I hope that most of you have picked up something of the basics of it already. And then I want to focus a little bit on why would we bother with a Methodist way of life. A lot of people can say to me, oh, David, it's just the latest initiative. It's another initiative. And I think there's something different here. But I want to say why I think we should bother with it. And then I want to think a little bit about how Methodist way of life reflection groups can work well. So one of the tenets of a Methodist way of life is that we meet together and reflect on faith together. And I want to talk a little bit about how that might work and how we might do that well. I'm just going to share my screen capture. I hope that's okay for you. Hopefully you can, wait a minute. Have you got a screen? Can somebody tell me, have you got a PowerPoint?
Yes, it's there.
Yes.
Great, thank you. You never sometimes know. I've lost my notes, which doesn't help. So Acts chapter 2, a verse from Acts chapter 2 that I just want to share with you. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship and the breaking of bread and the prayers. I think if we were to think about rhythms of life in the Christian church, then this is one of the earliest ones that we find. It comes at the beginning of the church after Pentecost. It's also one that has stuck in many different places. Here in the Yorkshire West district, we have the community at Murfield, a religious community. And this verse from Acts chapter 2 is there. It is the rhythm that holds them together as a community. But the thing about this bit of Acts chapter 2 is it's not just that it was a rhythm for their discipleship, for their own faith, but it was a rhythm that helped them to grow the church and to help others to discover who Jesus was. I don't really like talking about numbers, and I think the word successful is interesting in the life of the church. But if we wanted to talk about successful, I think any of us would be happy with 3,000 added to our number on one single day. So having a rhythm to their discipleship and their mission enabled them to be the church post-Pentecost that they were called to be. I'm going to share a video with you which introduces us a little bit of a Methodist way of life. And I'm just sharing which just tells you a little bit more.
As disciples, we try to live each day in response to God's love by following Jesus. A Methodist way of life is a way of growing as a Christian by reflecting on our faith journey and living out our faith. It's an encouragement to worship through prayer and looking and listening for God in Scripture and the world, caring for our neighbours and God's creation, challenging injustice and sharing our faith with others. A Methodist way of life is for everyone who wants to take up God's invitation to follow Jesus and live in a God-centred way. Don't worry if that feels a bit heavy. This is an encouragement to do the best we can, knowing we might fail sometimes. But we are committed to doing this together and with God's guidance, helping each other grow into the people God wants us to be. A Methodist way of life is like a plant trellis in a garden, a support that guides us as we grow and flourish.
So Methodist Way of Life, and you may have seen the commitment cards that look something like this, is based around these 12 commitments that you can see on the screen. An invitation with others to live our Christian life through these 12 areas of faith. The slide shows you the little logos that have just been developed that go with them. It is an invitation into a rhythm. It's not an invitation to a checklist. It's not an invitation to have to be able to do it all tomorrow. It's an invitation over time to find a rhythm by which we live out these commitments. And I believe that if we're living out these 12 commitments, we're living a balanced Christian life where we will be more intentional about both worship and service, learning and caring and evangelism. That discipleship and mission will balance each other well. I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about why we would bother with this. Just in terms of a couple of descriptions, Roger Walton, who was the former chair in the Yorkshire West District and the architect of much of this, says that this is what a Methodist way of life is. A Methodist way of life sets out what it means to be a Methodist. It puts into words how we try to live our lives in response to God's love, made known to us in Jesus. A Methodist way of life is both new and old. It is new in that it was first discussed by the Methodist Conference in 2018 and was shared with all Methodists in 2020. But it's based on what Methodists agreed was their calling in the year 2000. And that in turn was built on what Methodists have always done since the days of John Wesley. As they try to follow Jesus and live out the Christian faith, it is a way of living. And then when I was doing some reflecting on this a few years ago as part of my sabbatical, I wrote this, which says it in a slightly different way. The Methodist way of life is a way which Christians can live out their faith in Jesus in the power of the Holy Spirit. Through the Methodist way of life, they will deepen their discipleship and play their part in bringing God's love to the world. It is rooted in the Methodist tradition, but draws on a move of the Spirit, which is drawing Christians into community with each other in new ways. And I think for me, that last little bit of what I wrote is to recognise that living faith by a rhythm of life is not just something which has is not just being birthed at the moment in Methodism, but is being birthed in many other traditions and has been, historically in the monastic movement for thousands of years, but also in the what we might call the new monastic movement in the last 20 years in a number of different traditions. And so, having given you a brief introduction, just before I start to talk about why we might bother with this, I want to really just ask you to share what your initial thoughts are, either from what I've just said or from what you've picked up about a Methodist way of life so far. I want to just capture those on a whiteboard together, and my hope is that that might just help me to shape a little bit what we are talking about as we go along together. So, an invitation just to unmute and share questions or thoughts at the moment that we might just capture together on the whiteboard that we might then pick up as we go. Anybody got any for me, or pop them in the chat if that is easier for you, and I will copy and paste them onto the whiteboard. Google, Zoom's changed everything, haven't they? Now other people contribute. Thank you, Lydia. That's really helpful for doing that. Anybody else wants to chip in on the whiteboard, they're very welcome to do so, or unmute or chat. Great comments coming through. Thank you for those. Let me just speak, let me just say to the pink question, at the moment there is some rephrasing being done of some of this, and I think that will pick up on some of the language bits, but we can talk a little bit later about how we might be able.
That was me, David. And it's not so much it's not a criticism in any way, but what Laura and I found, and we did this with a youth group, and they were really thrown by the what's your prayer life like question.
Okay.
So when to see if it was just them, I tried it out on a few other groups, and many of them were like, "Well, we don't know how to pray, and I don't have a prayer life." So, there was something in there about, and I think that was the question, something like, "What's your prayer life like?" So, just to sort of clarify, and some of the other things, it's almost like it's a step further than people are at.
Okay.
So that was just to clarify.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. Just on the prayer things, just to flag a new resource. I don't know if you've seen these new prayer cards that respond directly to that comment that Victoria's just made of you don't know how to pray. These have just been produced by our wonderful friends in the Connectional team. There are 52 of them, and they pick up on some of the different themes of a Methodist way of life and encourage us to pray in different ways. So if I just choose one at random, which is a picture of the sunset, and it says on the back, sit by the window or outside early in the morning or late in the evening, watch the sun rising or setting, and as you sit and watch, thank God for the blessings that you have.
And where can people find those, David?
They're on the Methodist Publishing website in the Methodist Way of Life section. When you're in small groups later, I will find the link and pop it in the chat. What's nice about them is on the back, of some of them, you will see they have the little symbols, the little logos that relate to the 12 commitments. So you can see by undertaking this action, which of the commitments in the Methodist way of life you're connecting with. So just to flag that.
Can I just add something? I couldn't write on the board. I couldn't work out. And this might be rather specific, but it's about how people find a way to worship with others when they have suffered from spiritual trauma.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Catherine, for putting the link, and Vic for putting the link to the prayer cards in the chat. Okay, I'm going to save that, and we will return to it a little bit later, and give us a chance to think whether we've picked up on some of those as we've talked. So I want to go back then to this question of, well, why would we bother with any of this? Why would we bother with a Methodist way of life? And I always say, as I do this work, that there are, for me, 3 reasons why we would bother with a Methodist way of life. And they are, and you should now be able to see them. I think this is about holiness and fullness of life. I think it's about breathing in and breathing out. And to quote an American who I will come to later, it's about personal and not private. Let's just take a look at each of those together. In the Bible, in John's Gospel and chapter 10 and verse 10, Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And if I was to choose a verse which spoke a lot to me about faith, it would be this one. It speaks about a God who wants us to experience a full life in the love and grace of Jesus. And I think for me, a Methodist way of life is a tool to help us to experience and to live that full life that Jesus offers and promises to us. So it's about the fullness of life. But then if you were to dive into some Methodist history and into the Deed of Union, and for those of you who wonder what on earth the Deed of Union is, in 1932, when the 3 strands of Methodism, the Wesleyan Methodists, the Primitive Methodists, and the Bible Christians came back together to form the Methodist Church of Great Britain, the Deed of Union is the document that was written that brought those 3 denominations back into one. And in clause 4, the 4th section of the Deed of Union, it says this: in the providence of God, Methodism was raised up to spread scriptural holiness through the land. And I think I alluded earlier to some of the other evolutions in other denominations around new monasticism, about communities. And often when I talk about those in Methodist context, I don't get much traction. People don't get what I mean. And now I'm not saying that every Methodist wants to talk about holiness, or those we're seeking to work with beyond the church get holiness. But holiness is something within our Methodist spirituality that actually a Methodist way of life brings back for us. In Leviticus, we're told in the holiness code in the Old Testament that you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. A reminder that those in relationship with God are made holy by God. Calvin Samuel, who was director of the Wesley Study Centre in Durham and then principal of London School of Theology and now a circuit minister in the South East District, wrote a wonderful book called More Distinct: Reclaiming Holiness for the World Today. And Calvin says these two things about holiness. Holiness is rooted in the gracious action of God, and it is the heart of who God is. And what Calvin's trying to get across in that bit of the book is that holiness is something gifted to us by God through our relationship with Jesus, who comes to offer us life in all its fullness. You and I are the holy people of God, and therefore holiness is what we are. But Calvin then contrasts that. We cannot become holy unless God shares God's holiness with us. And yet we never become holy apart from seeking it, working at it, and pursuing the Holy One. So it's this idea that through our relationship with Jesus, we are the holy people of God. Yet holiness, living as holy people, is something that we need to seek and pursue. And a Methodist way of life and these 12 commitments gives us a framework to do that. So why would we bother with a Methodist way of life? Because it's a tool, it's a framework, it's something which helps us to experience that fullness of Jesus and to seek at being the holy people that God calls us to be. I think then the second reason why we bother with a Methodist way of life is because it's about breathing in and breathing out. Tara and I have a child who has a particular like of getting croup at the most unhelpful of moments. Any of you who know a child who's had croup will know that what they do is breathe in, but they struggle to breathe out, and they make a very funny noise that I'm not going to try and impersonate this morning. When we think about the Christian life, I'm sure we can all think of those people who are so busy in the life of the church, so busy serving others, so busy working hard, that all they ever do is breathe out their faith, but they never stop and breathe in. I'm sure you can also think of those people who are absolutely committed to Sunday worship, to a study group, but maybe shy away from engaging in mission activities, engaging in service. They're very good at the breathing in of faith, but not so good at the breathing out. A Methodist way of life invites us to live these 12 commitments in balance, where we pay as much attention to our worship and our prayer and our growing in faith as we do to our mission and our evangelism. In a time when the church is stretched and challenged, and to go to one of the questions on the whiteboard, which was about how do we make space for this, I don't necessarily think it's about making space for a Methodist way of life, but it's about finding a balance of those things that the commitments invite us to live. And just like our human bodies, if we don't breathe in and breathe out, we have a significant problem. The church doesn't find a way to both keep breathing in the love of God and also breathe it out, then we will have a problem. We might say we've already got the problem, and this is one of the ways we might attend to it. And then thirdly, I think a Methodist way of life and why we should bother with it is about faith being personal and not private. Jim Wallace is an American writer. He was faith advisor to a number of presidents of the United States. And in one of his books, he says that faith should always be personal, but not private. Always personal, but never private, I think is the exact quote. I really like this, that Christian faith invites a personal response to who the person of Jesus is, and a choice to follow Jesus and to live in the way of the kingdom. But that's not then something that we go and live in private. It's something we live out with others. By living our faith out with others, serving alongside others, worshipping alongside others, and through a Methodist way of life, hopefully being accountable to others, our own faith, and hopefully the faith of the church and the community we're part of, will grow and flourish. I think going back to the how do we make space for this, this doesn't necessarily even need to be an extra thing. I've been encouraging people to think about where are they already in groups that they could bring a Methodist way of life into. What might it look like for the worship band in a local church before they rehearse on a Wednesday or Thursday evening or whenever they rehearse, to spend 15 minutes reflecting together on the last week and sharing in response to some of the Methodist way of life questions? What might it look like for a junior church team when they meet to plan the next half term, to spend some of that time together reflecting on their own discipleship and their own faith? In the Airedale circuit in the Yorkshire West District, we've just opened in Keighley a new charity shop called Pre-Loved for children's and baby clothes. All the volunteers, whether they come from the church or they come from the community, are engaged in a Methodist way of life. They gather in the shop for half an hour before it opens. They reflect together on some of the Methodist way of life questions, and they pray together. This doesn't have to be another thing, although you may choose to have a separate Methodist way of life group, and that is good too. It's about embedding it into those things that we're already doing. So a Methodist way of life, for me, why would we bother? It's about being the holy people of God. It's about finding that balance of breathing in and breathing out. And it's about living faith alongside one another and not on our own. John Wesley was recorded as saying in the preface to one of the early hymn books that he knows no holiness but social holiness. It's easy in our 2022 understanding to think that Wesley was talking about social justice. In fact, Wesley wasn't. Social holiness for Wesley was about not being private with our faith, but about living it out with others. I think it's absolutely right that we understand that quote today to also be about social justice. And I think we see in Wesley someone who was passionate for social justice. But this is about holiness. It's about scriptural holiness being shared, and it's about social holiness living out our faith with others. So that's a brief introduction to what it is. I'm going to invite us to move into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. Or 50, oh no, we're a little ahead of my timing. So let's say 15 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes in breakout groups, and we'll come back together at 11:15. I want to invite you to reflect together on these two questions. How do you respond to the why of a Methodist way of life? And how might a Methodist way of life help you in your own discipleship? Welcome back, folks. Is there anything people want to just bring into the main room from the conversations you've had in your small groups? Anything people want to share either in the chat or by unmuting and just sharing your reflections back into the room?
Yeah, where can we get that from?
Well, I made it last week.
Oh, okay.
It's my PowerPoint slide, and I made it. I can email it out. It's not a problem. I think the other way to look at it, just if I find a web browser, the other way I find helpful to look at this, and we're just waiting for the resources to come out on this, which is why I haven't put it into the the screen, but I'm just sharing it on the sharing the web page, and I've put a link to the web page in the chat. But my colleagues in the Evangelism and Growth team are doing some work at the moment as presenting a Methodist way of life in a different way, which is around 12 stations on a train map. I'm trying desperately hard not to call it a tube map and keep suggesting they do the same, because we don't all live in London, and in fact neither of the two of them who developed it. But this is, you will recognise there that at the bottom the 12 logos, and then the stations on the train map, and the idea being that rather than this being a list of 12 priorities, these be 12 stations that we stop at and we spend time at as part of our Christian journey. And I do commend those resources to you, and just at the bottom of the page there are some further links that help us to think about what's it like to get on the train that travels around the stations. What is it to be attentive to journeying through the 12 stations, and how do we do some reflection on that around how we're changed, and similarly there are some resources of what's it like to be a leader in this model. So what is it to think about ourselves as a traveling companion? What is it a way as it to be leaders who make sure that each of the stations are open to new people, so that new people can get on the train through this station, and how do we make those new how are we open to those who are already on the train? So they are just some further resources that are coming about how we may see this in a different way. And Catherine just sent me a message saying you can send the PowerPoint. I'm very happy to send you a PDF, that's not a problem. Any other comments?
Within our group, we thought that the images card would be more useful to work with groups like the people who help at a parent and baby sort of group, or people that come in who aren't necessarily churched themselves. That we could use the card. We noticed that the card is quite wordy, the commitment card. So that either the train image or the image that you've created, which I didn't realise you created, is that's a helpful thing to use.
Thank you. Yeah, and my hope is that we will get some cards with some of the images on rather than just my cobbled thing, but we feel free to use that anywhere until we've got some stuff. Any other thoughts or comments people want to share before we just move on to think about small groups?
I think that comment you just made about the trains and about making it easy for people to get on, I just think we fall down on that in so many areas, and that really stood out to me, making it easy for people to get on.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, and those of us who were at Cliff, Vic and I were there, and one or two others at the Discipleship Pathways Day a couple of weeks ago. We talked a lot about how do we do that as well. Okay, I want to just move a little bit further down the journey of a Methodist way of life to talk about what does it mean to journey with others? What does it mean to do the personal and not private? I think I often say when I work with local churches that we say, oh, small groups and accountability is deep in our Methodist DNA. I think the much more lived reality is it was deep in our DNA about 100 years ago. And we now have whole generations of Methodists and those who are not yet part of our family who have no clue what accountability looks like or how we do this well. So I've given quite a lot of thought to this, and when I work with local churches, I offer them some suggestions of what we're trying to do, and I want to just share some of that here now. I've lost you all again. I found you all again. I found your pictures again. So what does it mean to journey with others in a Methodist way of life group? And what is it we're trying to do when we do that? some practical things, because these are always the questions people ask before some reflection. We need to think about who we will meet with. I think, as I said earlier, this might be something you do as part of an existing group, and therefore the who is fairly set. Although if you're a group of more than 5, you might want to start, you might want to think about a couple of smaller groups within the group. If you're setting up a new Methodist Way of Life reflection group, as I normally call them, then I think you're looking at 3 to 5 people. Any less than 3, and if somebody's away, it becomes not worth meeting, because you might be meeting with yourself. Even if there's 3 of you, if someone's away, the dynamic shifts when there's only 2 people in the conversation. So I think a group of 3 to 5 people. You need to think about when you'll meet and how often you'll meet. I think really anything less than monthly is unhelpful. I think some people will say, oh, let's meet every week. I think for most people that's quite unrealistic in terms of people's busy lives. But I think anything less than a month, so either fortnightly or monthly, is a good rhythm. You need to think about what you'll do when you meet together, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. And we need to think about how do we hold each other accountable in a way that is safe and robust, but not unsafe for anyone. And then we need to think a little bit about when do we review. So actually, these things can go on and they can lose their shape, but where do we pause and review and ask, is this working for us? So who will we meet with? When will we meet? And then I want to talk now a little bit about what do you do when you meet, how you do the accountability well, and what it might be to review. So to think first about what are we doing? When we meet in Methodist Way of Life groups, I think we're trying to do 5 things. We're trying to be encouraged and supported in our faith. We're trying to be helped to see more clearly what's going on, to be restored, to be challenged, and to be shared in an ongoing process. Let me talk about each of those in a little bit more depth. It's about being encouraged and supported in faith. That's about what's going well. That's about where are we struggling. That's about what might we do differently. That's about where is God calling us in the future. But it's about our faith. This is not a group to get together and be grumpy about the church in. This is not a group about our work, and I recognise I'm talking to a group of employees, but it is about where is our faith part of our work. And for many in our churches, that's a conversation which seems to have ceased to be happening, but is so important. So together, we're encouraging and we're supporting around faith, around fullness of life. And then we're trying to see more clearly what's going on. When we talk with others, when we share with others, they illuminate for us what is happening in our lives. They bring what is fuzzy into focus. They bring what maybe we can't quite understand into clarity. But I think the thing I love about this image is that even when some parts of life are brought into focus, there are still other bits that are not quite yet in focus. And I think it's okay to say in a Methodist Way of Life group, I don't want to talk about that yet. Or actually, you've landed on something that I've not had time to think about. So just let's keep that in the fuzziness for a while before we try and bring it into focus together. But by working with each other, by talking with each other, we can see more clearly what's going on. I hope that Methodist Way of Life groups are a place where we can be restored, where maybe when we're not seeing things as God sees them, or maybe where life in church or faith or work has been difficult, the encouragement of others will restore us. Equally, I hope it's a place where we can be challenged, where maybe we can be encouraged to go further for God, where maybe we can be challenged to do less because those who we meet with are seeing how busy we are. And to do that, we need to recognise this is not an ongoing process. I've heard twice in the last 2 weeks, oh, we've done a Methodist Way of Life, David. by which people mean we've picked the cards up, we've talked about it, and we've looked at the resources. This is an ongoing, hopefully lifelong process of reflecting with others and living faith with others. So 5 things that I think we're trying to do when we're in a Methodist Way of Life group. Some things we need to do that safely. We need to be with the best people for the group. I think there is a real tension here between inclusivity and safety. And those of you who are engaged with safeguarding training will know that that's always the tension, isn't it? If I, as a minister, randomly select people in my churches to be in Methodist Way of Life groups, the chances are we'll end up with groups where people are unhelpful to each other. At the same time, if I just let people self-select, I know the people in my congregation, and I don't have one anymore, so I can say this here. I know the people who will never be invited into any group because they're the more difficult characters. And let's not pretend that there are not difficult characters in the life of our churches. So we need to go through a delicate process. And I think there's a really significant role here for ministers and for leaders in churches of how do we ensure that we have the right people in groups. I've just seen the chat pop up, but I can't see it on my screen while I'm sharing. So it's a message for me. I'm afraid I have to see it or I've stopped screen sharing. We need to commit to being part of the group for this to be a safe space. If we're going to deepen our relationships and we're going to share openly and honestly and vulnerably, someone who doesn't come for 6 meetings and then thinks they can drop back in is not helpful to a safe dynamic. Now, of course, there's going to be occasions in my own Methodist Way of Life group, one of our members has just become a dad. That clearly we don't expect in the midst of a new baby in the house that they appear. But actually, if people just don't come and it's not important, it loses the safety and the depth of the sharing. We need to be willing to share and willing to listen. And there's both sides to that. We all know in the groups we've been in where there's one person who talks all the time. That's not helpful, and we all know that. But actually, neither in a place of sharing is the person who never shares, because there becomes an imbalance about what's known about people in the room. If one person only wants to listen, they're not contributing, and that can make others feel uncomfortable. We need to maintain confidentiality, and we need to understand what we mean by that. Many of you are in ministry, all of you are in ministry, and with a group of lay workers. But what does confidentiality mean? In this house, in the roles Tara and I hold, that means we don't talk to each other about what the people we work with share with us, because that will be breaking their confidentiality. In other households, what you say to one part of the partnership, we know is shared with the other. We need to have an honest conversation in new groups. What do we mean about confidentiality? And I always draw an analogy here from the work I do as training supervisors in the Responsible Grace training. I don't want people to never talk about being in a Methodist Way of Life group, because if it's good and if it's encouraging you in your faith, I want you to be an evangelist. I want you to be an advocate for the tool and the process. I absolutely want you to hold what's talked about from each individual's perspectives about their life in confidence. So we need to talk about what that means for us. And to be safe in a Methodist Way of Life, we need to be prayerful. And then there are some things, if we're going to be safe in these groups, if we're going to achieve those 5 aims, that we need not to do.
David,
yeah.
The question was, is this meeting in house groups or Bible study groups? So just to clarify what you're actually talking about.
Yeah, thank you. So either or is the answer there. Some people are choosing to take half an hour at the beginning of a Bible study group or half an hour at the beginning of a house group to reflect on a Methodist Way of Life. Others are choosing once a month to have a longer session. So they might do Bible study 3 weeks out of 4, and on the 4th week to look at a Methodist Way of Life. And in other contexts, people are setting up groups just to reflect on their faith life together using these questions. So it's an either or, and I can send to Catherine 2 PDFs that I've created, or 2 flyers I've created, one of which is 5 steps to do this in a new group that's just doing this, and one is 5 steps to embedding it into an existing group like a house group or a Bible study group. And I can send Catherine the PDFs of those to email out, and if anybody would like hard copies, let me know, and I've got hard copies. So just to go back, 5 things we're trying to do, some things we need to do that safely and well, and some things we need not to do. John Wesley spoke in his sermon on Christian perfection about the ability to become the perfect Christian, whilst being absolutely clear that as an individual he'd never achieved it. I think Wesley was theoretically right, but pragmatically I'm not sure any of us reach perfection in this life. And therefore when we meet, we need to be really careful that we're not trying to find perfection in each other, that we need to recognise that actually we will never get there. This is a lifelong journey. We need not to pick into people's stuff. We all have stuff, don't we? We all have the bits that we don't need to be aired with the washing. And actually, we just need to be sensitive to each other around what's going on and whether people are willing or not willing to bring that into the conversation. We need not to be accusatory. Why have you not done? You should have. We need to avoid these sorts of phrases, and I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a minute. But we do need to hold people accountable. If this doesn't have an element of, but actually, David, you said you were going to shift things to do this, or actually, we really sense God was calling you to do that, but you've not done anything about it. What's going on there? If we don't ask those questions, this is just another coffee shop. This is just another talking shop, but it mustn't be accusatory. We mustn't be coercive in any way, and we need not to be disrespectful. So those are some of the do's and don'ts. I'm very aware that these slides are very wordy, and partly that is that I'm still at the phase of evolving this, and I will reproduce the slides because I'm tweaking it as I go along. So it's quite wordy at the moment, but I hope to find some more images for some of these. So this is a bit of a, well, what might all that look like in practice, David? So actually, what might we do if we get together? And what I offer are 3 columns that offer 3 suggested ways. Something that you might do the first time you meet as a group, something you would do each time you meet, and something you would do when you review. I'm going to share this and one more slide, and then I'm going to let us have some conversation. When you meet for a first time, either because you're taking an existing house group and you're saying, actually, we're going to do something different here, or because you're meeting with a new group of people to form a Methodist Way of Life group, I encourage you to make a sharing agreement. Now, this is not a legal contract. You are choosing, you don't need to write a constitution, but this is about having a conversation about what are the parameters, what are the boundaries of your sharing together. I have a model sharing agreement on a handout I use when I do this as a workshop on site, and it asks things like all those things I've just talked about. Who's in the group? When and how will we meet? Who's going to bring the biscuits if we're going to have biscuits or cake? What will we do when we meet? So talking through something like this slide and saying, is this going to work for us? Talking about how will you do the challenge and accountability? What will work for you as a group? What does confidentiality mean? And when will you review? Now, you don't have to use a form and you don't have to write it down, but just have those conversations about what I've just talked about. How are we going to make this work well for us? And in that, talk about how you will pray together. Some people find praying out loud really easy. Others find that really difficult. What will prayer look like for you as a group? Do you need to get a set of the cards? Because that really makes you go, ugh, and actually just say, we'll choose one of the cards each time we meet, and that's how we'll pray. How are we going to pray? And then when you first meet, I encourage you to talk about your faith. 5-6 minutes each. Just explain to others in the group how you've ended up where you are. Why are you in the church you're part of? Where did you first meet with Jesus? Just share some story. That gives a real foundation for your life as a group together. And then have a look at the back of the Methodist Way of Life cards, choose a couple of questions and just start to experience what it feels like. Pray together and in whichever way you feel comfortable, and fix some dates. I think it's really good if people have got dates in for at least the next 3 months. That's part of making this important. That's part of this being focused. So that's a first time together. And then each time you meet, you know, this is not a machine. We're not robots. We don't have to stick to fervent rules. You're human beings. Catch up, drink tea, eat cake, just talk together about life. And I think that's really important. And pray together as you open your time together. And this is absolutely key, I think, to the accountability bit. Think back to what you were talking about last time you met. What were the questions you asked last time you met? And asked how people have got on at what they've said they will do. So let me give you an example. If you've talked about in your first meeting, the question on the back of the card, how and what are you learning now? And as part of that conversation, one of you has said, actually, I'm really interested in this particular part of my faith, and I'm going to read a book about that. There's nothing more demoralizing than then having made the time to read that book for nobody to ask you about it. So how have you done since the last meeting is, oh, Joe Bloggs, you said you were going to read a book on justice. Tell us, how was it? Give a chance for that feedback to come into the conversation. And if Joe Bloggs says, well, actually, I haven't read the book, then that's the accountable bit. Okay, well, tell us about that. What's been the challenge? Is there anything we can do to help? What might help you to read the book? So what we're creating is a loop for one meeting where we say how we're doing about one of the questions, and we talk about what might be the same, what might be different, what might not be different. And then when we come back, we're asking each other about that bit again. How have we done at what we've said we're going to do? And that's the accountability bit. But it's how have you done at what you've said or we've agreed you'll do. It's not random accountability, because that's accusatory. So it's not, oh, Joe Bloggs, you said you'd read a book on justice. Have you read the 17 titles that I found about social justice in the library? Well, no, because Joe Bloggs said he'd read one book. So the accountability bit is, has he read the one book? Not has he read the 17 you think he should have read. And then you move on and you look at some other questions, and you need to work out together how you're going to do that. So some people choose one of the 4 sections each time they meet, and they will look at all 4 questions in a section. Some people will choose one question from each section. Some people will just choose one question. My top tips would be, don't try and do all 16 every time you meet, not helpful. And if you are going to move down the sections, jump about, because if you do worship and then learning and caring, you do all the breathing in and none of the breathing out. So if you're going to jump down the sections, I would encourage worship, then service, then learning and caring, and then evangelism to find that balance. You're having a conversation. You're talking about how you respond to the question. You're reflecting back to each other what you hear. And you may be asking, well, what might you do differently? What might you do the same? And that then is what you would come back to next time you meet. Praying for each other, praying for what's the conversation you've had. Remember the old adage, God is in your conversation. You do not need to repeat with dear Lord at the beginning everything you've just talked about, but you are praying together. And then I encourage you just to say to each other, have we kept to our sharing agreement? Have we met today in a way which reflects how we said we would meet? If you are uncomfortable with a part of the conversation that's been had, if you wait another month to express that, you will feel frustrated. It will dig away. It will become bigger than maybe it needs to be. So an opportunity, have kept to our sharing agreement? Have we operated in the way that we wanted to operate together? And a closing prayer, if you want, there's quite a lot of praying in there, but I think prayer is important. And looking at dates, just checking that the dates we've got in the diary are okay, and do we need to move forward? And then a chance to review in the third column. And I think in new groups, you probably need to do this after 6 months, but I think you could probably then do it annually. This is not just reviewing how we're working, but it's a chance to pause and look back and say, well, what's God done through the last period of time, through the last 6 months, through the last year? How have we changed as individuals? What do we see in each other that God has done and that God has drawn out of us and that God has called us to? And what is there to celebrate there? Do we want to keep meeting together? Is this helpful? Is there something missional we could do together? One of my great passions for a Methodist Way of Life is that God calls the groups that are meeting together, not just to talk, but to act and to reach out in mission. So I think after 6 months, after a year, is the right time to say, is there something we could do together? That doesn't have to be massive. That doesn't have to be plant a new church. That might be, we're going to prayer walk in this community that we all live in. It might be, we're going to pick litter in the local park. It might be we feel called to respond to something within the life of the church that's looking for volunteers, but we'll do it together. Do we need to adjust our sharing agreement and pray and fix dates? So I hope what I'm laying out there is a way that you build some good foundations, a way that creates a looking back as well as a looking forwards when you meet, which is how we build the accountability in, and then a chance to review from time to time. I want just to drill down into one little bit before we have some conversation. When we are responding to the questions, when we ask them to one another and we hear the answers, we hear all sorts of things that others might not hear. But we need to be sensitive in how we respond to that. I want to introduce you to 3 phrases which those of us engaged with supervision in the Methodist Church use regularly. I notice, I wonder, I realise. And they come from the Greek in John's Gospel, in John chapter 20. And in John chapter 20 is the resurrection appearance, or the empty tomb, when Mary and the women go to the tomb. And in that passage in John's Gospel, in English, it says they saw, S-A-W, saw 3 times. But in the Greek, the word saw is translated in 3 different ways. The first translation of they saw is that they noticed. And that was what happens when Mary and the women arrive in the garden. And they saw that the tomb was rolled away. The true translation of the Greek, they noticed that the tomb rolled away. And when we've listened to people, there will be things that we've noticed. There will be things we've seen in what they've said. And if we respond with, it looks like, I think you're doing this, we suddenly very quickly become accusatory. Whereas if we simply notice what's there, we give the person talking a chance to respond. I notice that life seems really busy at the moment. I notice that God seems to be stirring something in you. I notice that you've arrived really flustered today. What are we noticing that might just illuminate in our conversation what's going on? We go back to John chapter 20. Of course, the men arrive, don't they? Because, they don't really believe the women, sadly. And they go into the tomb and they saw the grave clothes and they saw that the tomb was empty. And they start to wonder in that bit of the passage is that they've started to wonder. They wonder where the body has gone. because the grave clothes are here. And again, as we listen to people, we can start to wonder with them. I wonder whether that stirring in God is that God's got something for you. I wonder whether the busyness at the moment, which means you're not praying, is just one of those seasons of life, or whether actually it's something you need to be attentive to. I wonder whether that person who you've had a chance to talk about your faith might be ready for an invitation to church. You're not saying, oh, that person that you've talked to about Jesus, I think you really must invite them to church next week. You're wondering, would this be helpful for that next phase of conversation? And then to go back to John's gospel, they see the gardener and they realize, the saw in the last bit of the story is that they realize that Jesus is risen. And when we use these three phrases in supervision, to notice and to wonder is in the gift of the supervisor. And we hope through the noticing and wondering of the supervisor that the supervisee will do some realizing. Methodist Way of Life groups are not supervision. And actually we may realize for other people. But in the main, I hope that through your noticing and wondering to the question responses of those in your group, that person who is responding will realize, see more clearly some of what God is saying to them. So I offer you, I notice, I wonder, and I realize there's a way that you can respond to the questions, to how other people answer the questions in a healthy and whole sort of way. And so I want to pause there. I've said a lot, but we've got about 10 minutes. I just want to invite you into breakout groups for 10 minutes to ask the questions, would you find this sort of Methodist Way of Life group helpful in your discipleship? And what steps might you be able to take to form one? I've got the whiteboard back up here, and I think we've answered most of the questions that people put there. Alison, I just want to acknowledge that the one you've asked is really significant, and I think we need to ponder how we respond to that, and I think it's really important for individuals not to feel coerced into anything that is going to be unhelpful to them given the journey they've been on. And if that's a helpful conversation to pick up with me a bit more, then feel free to drop me a line, and I'm happy to unpack that with you, or very helpfully with your local ministers, who I'm sure would be happy, or touchstone in your circuit as well. So do, if that's helpful. Paula, were you waving bye to someone, or were you waving bye to Heather?
Sorry, I just waved bye to Heather, sorry.
That's fine. Any other comments people want to just bring into the room before we come to a close of this bit of today?
One of the things that we did think would be helpful going forward, and I don't know if there's a plan for this, is that we're thinking about doing this in our church come September, and introducing it, training for the house group leaders, that kind of thing. Is training going to be fed down, and so whether that would be really helpful.
Yeah, that's fine. In terms of the Yorkshire West District, I can say to people, just get in touch with me and we can see what we can do to make that happen. In terms of the wider region, do have a conversation with my colleagues in the Learning Network, because they serve with me across the region, and I'm sure would be happy to do some of that as well. Just before I offer myself out to the whole region, which would not be very helpful. Thank you. Well, it's been lovely to be with you. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope you have a good rest of your morning together.